Until now, we have been looking only at stories. That may be a mistake. If the patterns we have traced belong exclusively to fiction, then they tell us something about storytelling and little else. At most, we have identified a successful narrative formula. But if the same sequence appears somewhere beyond novels, films, and myths, the investigation changes entirely. The obvious place to look is not history, nor religion, nor literature. It is ordinary human life. Consider for a moment the earliest years of childhood. A child enters the world knowing almost nothing about it. The world already exists, complete with its own rules, dangers, and meanings. Long before the child understands where they are, others already do. Someone else knows their name. Someone else knows their family. Someone else understands the house in which they live, the language they hear, the customs they are expected to follow, and the countless dangers they cannot yet recognize. In the beginning, reality reaches the child through other people. Parents point, parents name, parents explain. This is a bird. That is fire. Don't touch. Come here. The child does not discover the world alone. The world is introduced. That observation, by itself, may seem almost too ordinary to notice. Yet, it bears a curious resemblance to the stories we have just examined. There, too, the hidden world already exists. There, too, someone else understands it first. There, too, the protagonist must gradually learn to see what others have seen all along. Perhaps this is only a superficial similarity. Children grow up. Heroes go on adventures. One is psychology. The other is fiction. No serious conclusion should be drawn from resemblance alone. And yet, for the first time, the patterns are no longer confined to stories. They have appeared somewhere else. That is enough to justify the next question. What if these narratives are not inventing a pattern? What if they are remembering one? There is something curious about the way every child enters the world. Unlike the heroes we have been following, children do not receive letters from Hogwarts or messages from distant galaxies. There are no mysterious mentors waiting at the end of the driveway. Yet, in another sense, their situation is remarkably similar. A child is born into a world they did not create and do not understand. Long before they can speak, the people around them already know their name. They know where they belong, what language they will speak, what dangers surround them, and which rules cannot be broken. The child, meanwhile, knows almost none of this. Like Harry, they enter a world that already knows who they are. Like Luke, they inherit a history that began long before they arrived. Like Neo, they gradually discover that reality is far larger than it first appeared. Of course, these are not the same experiences. No child discovers that they are secretly a wizard. No parent hands their son a lightsaber. No one is offered a red pill. The resemblance lies elsewhere. In both cases, the individual begins inside a reality they cannot yet see. Understanding arrives gradually, always through someone else. Parents point before children recognize. Parents name before children understand. Parents explain before children can ask. The world is not discovered alone. It is introduced. That observation proves nothing. Resemblance is not evidence. But it does make the question more difficult to dismiss. If the same structure appears in childhood and in fiction, perhaps the stories are doing more than entertaining us. Perhaps they are returning again and again to one of the oldest experiences human beings ever have. Not the experience of adventure, the experience of awakening. There is another similarity that is easy to overlook. Children do not simply learn facts, they learn significance. A parent does not merely point to a bird and supply its name. They also teach whether it is beautiful, harmless, dangerous, ordinary, or rare. They do not merely identify fire. They teach caution. They do not merely describe another person. They teach trust, suspicion, kindness, gratitude, and responsibility. The world arrives already interpreted. Long before children develop their own understanding, they borrow someone else's. Perhaps that is why the guide appears so consistently in stories. Hagrid does more than reveal Hogwarts. He tells Harry what kind of place it is. Obi-Wan does more than introduce the Force. He gives Luke a way of understanding it. Morpheus does more than expose the Matrix. He offers Neo an entirely different interpretation of reality. Information alone would not accomplish this. Facts can describe a world. They cannot, by themselves, teach someone how to inhabit it. That requires another person. Someone who has already learned to see. Someone who can lend that vision to another until it gradually becomes their own. This may explain why the guide is almost never replaced by a book, a map, or a machine. Stories are not merely transferring knowledge. They are depicting apprenticeship. Not apprenticeship to a profession, but to reality itself. Children experience something remarkably similar. Before they judge the world for themselves, they first learn to judge it through the eyes of those who raise them. Only much later do they begin to separate their own understanding from the understanding they inherited. That, too, feels strangely familiar. The heroes we have been following rarely remain students forever. Eventually, they question their guides. Sometimes they disagree with them. Sometimes they surpass them. Sometimes they lose them altogether. Perhaps that is not the end of the pattern. Perhaps it is the next stage. For if every child first learns the world through another person's eyes, there must eventually come a moment when those borrowed eyes are no longer enough. And if stories are tracing the same journey, we should expect to find that moment there as well. If the guide exists to help the protagonist, why do stories so often take the guide away? It happens with surprising regularity. Obi-Wan is killed before Luke's journey is complete. Dumbledore dies before Harry's final confrontation with Voldemort. Morpheus, although he survives, eventually ceases to provide answers. Neo reaches a point where even Morpheus can no longer tell him what to do. The pattern extends well beyond these stories. Again and again, the person who first revealed the hidden world becomes absent, powerless, mistaken, or simply unable to continue leading. At first glance, this seems like an obvious dramatic device. The mentor has served their purpose. Removing them raises the stakes and forces the hero to act alone. That explanation is certainly plausible, but it leaves an important question unanswered. Why does this particular device appear so consistently? Why not leave the guide beside the protagonist until the very end? After all, a wise companion would make victory more likely. Yet stories repeatedly choose the opposite. The person who once made the world intelligible gradually steps aside. The protagonist must continue without them. There is an interesting parallel in ordinary life. A young child depends almost completely on the judgment of parents. They borrow their understanding of the world from someone else's experience. Over time, that dependence changes. The parent does not necessarily disappear. What disappears is something else. The assumption that another person can always provide the right answer. There comes a point when inherited understanding is no longer sufficient. The child must begin judging reality for themselves. The transition is rarely comfortable. It involves uncertainty, mistakes, responsibility. In many ways, it feels like the loss of a guide, even when the guide is still present. Perhaps that is why these stories so often remove the mentor. Not because wisdom has become unnecessary, but because borrowed wisdom eventually reaches its limit. The journey cannot be completed by following someone else's understanding. At some point, the protagonist must risk seeing the world with their own eyes. If that is true, then the guide was never the destination. The guide was preparing the protagonist for the moment they would no longer need one. At this point, it is worth pausing to look back. Individually, each pattern we have examined seems unremarkable. A hidden world, a guide, an invitation, a reluctant hero, the loss of the guide. None of these elements is unique. Any one of them could be explained as a convenient storytelling device. Together, however, they begin to form something more coherent. They no longer look like independent conventions. They look like successive stages of the same process. The protagonist begins inside a world they mistake for the whole of reality. Someone introduces them to a larger reality they cannot yet understand. An invitation is extended. The invitation is resisted. A choice is made. The world grows larger. The guide gradually steps aside. The protagonist learns to stand within that larger world without borrowed certainty. This sequence should feel familiar by now. Not because we have imposed it upon the stories, but because it has continued to survive every comparison we have made. The question then is no longer whether the pattern exists. The question is what kind of pattern it is. One possibility is that we have simply identified an unusually successful narrative formula. Another is that these stories are repeatedly reconstructing a recognizable process of human development. The evidence at this stage cannot decide between those possibilities, but it does allow us to ask a more precise question than the one with which we began. We started by asking why unrelated stories resemble one another. Now we can ask something far more specific. Why do so many stories organize themselves around the gradual expansion of a person's understanding of reality? That is a narrower question. It is also a more difficult one. Notice what has quietly disappeared. Very little of this sequence depends on magic, or spaceships, or dragons, or superpowers. Strip those away, and the underlying movement remains almost unchanged. A smaller world gives way to a larger one. Borrowed understanding gives way to personal understanding. Dependence gives way to responsibility. Whatever these stories are doing, they seem remarkably uninterested in fantasy for its own sake. Fantasy appears to be the language, not the subject. If that is true, then we may have been looking in the wrong place all along. The hidden world is not the mystery. The mystery is the transformation that the hidden world makes possible.
If these stories were only about discovering a larger world, they ought to become easier once that discovery has been made. Instead, they almost always become more difficult. Harry's life does not improve when he reaches Hogwarts. It becomes more dangerous. Every answer seems to uncover a deeper mystery. Luke's first lessons in the Force do not bring certainty. They confront him with loss, sacrifice, and eventually the devastating truth about his own father. Neo's awakening is no different. The truth he has spent his life searching for is far harsher than the illusion from which he escaped. Freedom demands responsibilities he never imagined. This pattern is as persistent as the others. The hidden world is not a refuge from reality. It is a deeper encounter with reality. The protagonist gains understanding, but understanding carries a price. At first, this seems almost backwards. If ignorance limits us, shouldn't knowledge liberate us? In one sense, it does. Harry would never choose to return permanently to life with the Dursleys. Luke would not willingly exchange his understanding of the Force for the quiet certainty of the moisture farm. Neo would never ask to forget what he has learned. Yet none of them receives knowledge without also inheriting a burden. To know more is to become responsible for more. That observation extends beyond fiction. Children often believe that adulthood means freedom. Adults know that it also means responsibility. Every genuine expansion of understanding enlarges not only what a person can do, but what a person must do. The pattern begins to look strangely familiar. Knowledge enlarges the world. It also enlarges obligation. Perhaps this is why the hidden world is introduced so carefully. It is not merely revealing secrets. It is asking whether the protagonist is willing to bear the weight that accompanies them. That possibility deserves consideration. If these stories repeatedly connect understanding with responsibility, then their deepest concern may not be adventure at all. It may be maturity. Not maturity measured by age, maturity measured by the capacity to see more of reality and to accept the responsibilities that reality imposes. There comes a moment in nearly every human life when the world becomes larger than it was before. Sometimes the change is gradual. Sometimes it arrives without warning. A child learns that adults are not all powerful. A student discovers that knowledge is more complicated than school suggested. A young adult realizes that justice, love, success, and failure rarely fit the simple categories they once imagined. Nothing visible has changed. The world is the same. Yet, it is no longer the same world. Something similar happens to the protagonists we have been following. Harry enters Hogwarts believing that he has escaped one world for a better one. Before long, he discovers that the wizarding world has its own prejudice, fears, corruption, and tragedies. Luke imagines the Jedi as flawless heroes. He eventually learns that their history is more complicated than legend allowed. Neo believes that escaping the Matrix will finally reveal reality in its pure form. Instead, every answer uncovers another question. Even freedom proves more difficult than he expected. The pattern repeats itself. Each new world eventually becomes an ordinary world. Each revelation becomes the starting point for another revelation. Each certainty gives way to a larger uncertainty. This is a curious feature of both stories and life. Transformation rarely ends with a single awakening. Every expansion of understanding reveals the limits of the understanding that came before. Perhaps this is why so many stories unfold in stages rather than in a single dramatic revelation. One hidden world is not enough. The protagonist must repeatedly outgrow their own picture of reality. That process feels strangely familiar. Children outgrow childhood. Students outgrow teachers. Apprentices outgrow apprenticeship. Each stage provides a genuine understanding of the world. Each stage also proves incomplete. The earlier understanding was not false. It was simply too small. That distinction matters. Growth does not always require abandoning what came before. More often, it requires placing it within a larger whole. If that is true, then these stories are describing something more subtle than the triumph of knowledge over ignorance. They are describing the continual reorganization of understanding itself. The hidden world is not discovered once. It is discovered again and again, each time from a higher vantage point. Perhaps that is why these stories continue to resonate long after childhood. They are not reminding us of a single transformation. They are reminding us that transformation never truly ends.
By now, our emerging picture seems almost too neat. Stories begin in an ordinary world. A larger reality is revealed. A guide appears. The guide disappears. Understanding expands. Responsibility grows. It is tempting to believe we have found a universal pattern. That temptation deserves to be resisted. Not every story follows this path. Some begin with characters who already understand the world they inhabit. Others focus less on transformation than on endurance. Their protagonists do not become different people. Instead, they reveal who they have been all along. Still others end in failure. The hero refuses the invitation. The larger reality is rejected. Understanding arrives too late, or never arrives at all. These stories matter. If our model cannot account for them, then our model is incomplete. Consider tragedy. In many tragedies, the protagonist does not fail because they lack opportunity. They fail because they cannot relinquish an earlier understanding of the world. Their downfall is not ignorance alone. It is attachment. They continue acting as though reality was simpler than it has become. The world changes. They do not. Suddenly, our earlier observations begin to look different. Perhaps the defining feature of transformation is not acquiring new knowledge. Perhaps it is surrendering an older certainty. That is a far more difficult task. Learning new facts is often pleasurable. Letting go of an identity, a belief, or a familiar picture of reality can feel like a kind of loss. Children do not simply gain adulthood. They lose childhood. Students do not merely acquire expertise. They lose the comforting confidence that every problem has a clear answer. The same pattern appears in our stories. Luke cannot become who he is meant to become while clinging to the life he imagined on Tatooine. Harry cannot remain the neglected boy living under the stairs. Neo cannot continue believing that the Matrix is the whole of reality. Each transformation asks for something. Before it offers something, it asks for relinquishment. Seen in this light, the guide's disappearance takes on another meaning. The guide is not removed simply to make the hero independent. The guide is removed because dependence itself has become the next certainty that must be surrendered. Transformation is not the accumulation of truths. It is the repeated willingness to outgrow them. Perhaps that is why these stories move us so deeply. Most of us have experienced moments when the hardest part of growing was not discovering something new. It was admitting that the world was no longer the one we thought we understood.